Matthew David Segall is assistant professor in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, California. He is the author of The Reemergence of Shelling, Philosophy in a Time of Emergency, and Physics of the World Soul, Whitehead's Adventure in Cosmology. He is a multidisciplinary researcher focusing on applications of process philosophy across the natural and social sciences, and he blogs regularly at footnotestoplato.com. His paper today is Standing Firm in the Flux on Whitehead's Eternal Objects.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Brian. Great to be here. It's wonderful to hear everyone's presentations yesterday. So I have written a paper that's ballooned to like 12,000 words now. I can't obviously share everything with you, but I am going to read a couple of pages that address Whitehead's abstractive hierarchies, which he unpacks in Science in the Modern World. But let me quickly kind of summarize what I do on the rest of the paper. It started just as a summary of Chapter 10 of Science in the Modern World on abstraction, which is a notoriously difficult, vexing, and in Whitehead's words, irksome chapter. I can confirm that that is the case. What I've done though is expand my my attempt to unpack and elucidate that chapter with excerpts from both of the Harvard lecture volumes, and also some additional excerpts from Process and Reality, because I think in Science in the Modern World, though Whitehead does have a chapter on God and begins to develop his process theology, there's a sense in which the realm of eternal objects is underdeveloped in that book, and only really, I think, takes its proper form when you bring in not only the primordial nature, which he does address in chapter 11 of Science in the Modern World, but the consequent nature. So I go through chapter 10 in this paper and try to push against those who would want to eliminate eternal objects from Whitehead's scheme to keep only the processual dimension of his philosophy. So I'm working through all of that, and then I have a section at the end responding to some critics, including Charles Hartshorne, Victor Lowe, John Dewey. That letter that Joe shared with us yesterday from Dewey to Whitehead ended up getting into this paper as I've continued to revise it. Richard Rorty, who wrote his master's thesis on Whitehead and had a couple of other early papers on Whitehead where he seemed quite sympathetic, though later obviously became more of a Wittgensteinian. So that's basically what the paper covers, but let me zero in on a particular section here that is dealing with abstractive hierarchies, which I find confusing, and I'm hoping that you all can help me. So Whitehead in chapter 10 of Science in the Modern World tells us that eternal objects, they have both an individual and a relational essence. Now, the relational essence of an eternal object, he says, is its determinate internal relation to every other object in the infinite realm of possibility and to actuality generally. Each eternal object is systematically and necessarily constituted by its relations to every other eternal object, such that ingressing one ingresses all, though with gradation of relevance. The internal relations of eternal objects are said to take the form of an indefinite number of what he calls abstractive hierarchies, with simple objects at their base, complex objects at their vertex, and objects of proximate complexity in between. An eternal object in its relational essence is said to remain isolated from actuality, only untangling its individual essence because of an actual occasion's decision to fuse it together with some finite subset of other possibilities in its novel aesthetic synthesis, with irrelevant possibilities thrust into the systematic substratum. In reflecting on the nature of abstractive hierarchies, Whitehead says we can conceive of a route of progress in any, quote, assigned mode of abstraction, which I take to mean that it is up to the one doing the analysis to define which progression of eternal objects they are interested in analyzing. Any such assignment implies the activity of conceptual prehension and assumes a spatiotemporal perspective on the realm of possibility. This stands in contrast to what Whitehead says regarding the relations among eternal objects themselves, which are entirely, quote, unselective and systematically complete. I take him to mean that the sort of assignment of mode made by defining where a finite hierarchy begins and ends, that is, its base and its vertex, is in some sense arbitrarily imposed by the interests motivating the analysis. We may ask at this point whether or to what extent it is feasible to examine the internal relations among possibilities in themselves. Is there not a problem analogous to the quantum measurement problem, whereby our very attempt to peek into hierarchies of pure possibility necessarily contaminates what it was we were attempting to analyze by dragging a selection of eternal objects from the indefinite multiplicity of their isolation into the penumbral horizon of our conscious experience? In other words, our conceptual prehension of an individual eternal object tugs an associated hierarchy of adjacent objects with it into quasi-actuality, a mental act that Whitehead likens to Platonic reminiscence in Process and Reality. Whitehead indicates that the inevitable abruptness, as he calls it, of our mental capacities means we can only trace these relations so far, an issue that I discuss later in this paper in connection with God's primordial envisagement. Whitehead's example of a tetrahedron in chapter 10 of Science in the Modern World invites consideration of the case of the Platonic solids as a candidate abstractive hierarchy of regular polyhedrons. Whitehead himself assigns the tetrahedron to a more general mode of abstraction such that it can be further analyzed into colored surfaces, presumably then lines and points. Interestingly, though, despite the four-sidedness of a tetrahedron, Whitehead analyzes it into the colors of three surfaces, presumably because only three would be visible from some spatio-temporal perspective anywhere at any time. Attempting to assign a mode of abstraction as the hierarchy of Platonic solids, however, it leads to problems. Though at first glance it might appear to be the simplest such solid, the tetrahedron cannot be assigned as the base of a finite abstractive hierarchy, since, like the other solids, the octahedron, hexahedron, or cube, dodecahedron, and icosahedron, it can be derived via analysis from, inscribed within, and so transform into every other such solid, thus confounding attempts to determine which is the base and which the vertex. As Plato put it in the Timaeus, the elemental shapes form a generative cycle rather than a hierarchy. As I explore below in a moment, using the example of color, it is difficult to discriminate truly simple from more complex objects. Even when dealing with eternal objects of the objective species, like geometric points, it is not so easy to determine when we have grasped something simple. A point is abstract, indeed, having in Euclidean geometry no volume or area, but simply a position. A point can also be defined as complex, for example, a series of indefinitely converging regions, as Whitehead has it. Isabel Stengers has argued that by the time he wrote Process and Reality, Whitehead abandoned his earlier idea of abstractive hierarchies, since it appeared to imply a devaluation of actuality as nothing but the realization of ideal situations predetermined in advance. It is true that in Process and Reality, Whitehead makes no mention of eternal objects isolated in abstractive hierarchies. Instead, he mentions only hierarchies of societies and of feelings. He does speak of what he calls grades of generic abstraction, but he doubts, quote, whether simplicity is ever more than a relative term, having regard to some definite procedure of analysis. It is their abstract isolation from the decisiveness of actualization that allows incompatible possibilities to coexist. Eternal objects considered an abstraction from actuality have contraries in their relational essences that cannot be simultaneously ingressed. Thus, In the realm of possibility, the law of non-contradiction cannot be applied. What else might be said about the internal relations among eternal objects, isolated in abstractive hierarchies, remains an open and, as Whitehead warned, vexing question. What can be said for now is that Whitehead's speculations about the logic of pure possibility were anchored by his concern to avoid devaluing the creative decisions constituting actualities by succumbing to the view Bergson complained about. That is, the construal of eternal objects as, quote, already stored up in some cupboard reserved for possibles, as he says in a chapter in The Creative Mind. Such a view would stymie Whitehead's sense of philosophy as explanatory not of concreteness but of abstraction, and would challenge his commitment to an open future of creative advance by freezing eternal objects as though in a morgue, like the pale outlines of lifeless bodies awaiting the transfusion of blood granted by actualization, the latter seemingly adding little more than the diminutive qualities of earthly motion, like growth and decay, to a morphology already perfected in heaven. As Bergson joked, one might as well claim that the man in flesh and blood comes from the materialization of his image seen in the mirror. Whitehead could be said to waver on these questions, if not in the form of his doctrine, then at least in his emphasis, but he could also be said to be faithfully displaying the dipolar logic of the process of realization. In 1924, he is recorded as saying that, quote, all reference to possibility is a reference to some ground which is in the occasion, but which is not occasional. That's from HL1. While in 1925, in Science in the Modern World, he speaks of objects isolated in eternity. Quote, the eternal objects are isolated because their relationships as possibilities are expressible without reference to their respective individual essences. In 1927, in the second volume of the Harvard Lectures, he insists that there are, quote, no eternal objects in isolation from the actual world, the very idea being meaningless. Every eternal object has a meaning with respect to its possible functioning in the actual world. An eternal object gives no information about itself. By 1940, in his late essay Mathematics and the Good, his sense of the dipolarity between possibility and actuality is even more apparent. Quote, every pattern can only exist in virtue of the doom of realization, actual or conceptual, and this doom consigns the pattern to play its part in an uprush of feeling, which is the awakening of infinitude to finite activity. Such is the nature of existence. It is the acquisition of pattern by feeling, in its emphasis on a finite group of selected particulars, which are the entities patterned. Can anything be said to remain isolated in this depiction of the process of realization? Let us consider the case of color. In Process and Reality, Whitehead distinguishes a special category of subjective eternal objects, namely simple sensa, that do not express a manner or a complex pattern of relatedness to other eternal objects. If the color sensa are included among the simple sensa, it would imply that an individual color can, in principle, ingress independently of any patterned contrast with other colors. We can at least conceptually prehend the individual essence of some particular color previously perceived and imaginatively fill in a gap in a gradient of the same color, but such indefinite prehensions achieve only restricted ingression of the relevant eternal objects. Unrestricted ingression of color as an objective fact in the physical world, on the other hand, assuming Whitehead's unbifurcated picture of nature, would appear to presuppose a patterned contrast of colors. When philosophers have tried to think through the abstract relations among color sensa, they tend to think of them in terms of gradation of shade or in terms of the Newtonian spectrum, identified with the diverse refrangibilities or wavelengths of light in more contemporary terms that are split by a prism. In the former case, the gradations, contrast seems self-evident, and in the latter case, colors are treated as though the spectral relation was simply an arbitrary series with each supposedly simple color sensum isolated at the base level of an abstractive hierarchy, save perhaps white light, which is said to include all the colors. As Whitehead says, green is green, and there's the end of it. in modes of thought, since it cannot be analyzed into a relationship of components, as he says in Science in the Modern World. But if we consider Goethe's organic theory of color phenomena and his cycle of prism experiments, dark or black and light or white would have to be considered primal, basic, or simple, with blue and yellow the proximate result of their contrast, followed by green as an intensification of the contrast of blue and yellow, and so forth. Now, the experimental phenomena are a little bit more complex than this. I'm going to switch over quickly to this video, which will show you, for those unfamiliar with Goethe's color theory, the boundary colors, yellow and blue, actually have a little bit of red and violet mixed in with them, appearing at the edges where light and shadow meet. But the general point here, by drawing on bringing Goethe into this conversation, is that color sensa appear in ordered phases as intensifying contrasts. The Goethean understanding of color as an archetypal pattern of metamorphosis involving the participation of eyes, atmosphere, sunlight, and shadow implies a distinct relation of the color sensa to one another as possibilities and to space-time, which, if color sensa are to be counted among the simple sensa, is not so easily reconciled with Whitehead's retreat from empirical investigation of the physiology of the human body, as he puts it, into convenient metaphysical principles. That's from Process and Reality. So you could see in that quick video the way that the blue and yellow come together to produce green as a result of their mixing or their contrast. Whitehead is clear that a color sensum, though it, quote, haunts time like a spirit, nonetheless cannot be dissociated from its potentiality for ingression. Apart from memories, he claims red is not accessible to us by merely thinking of redness. He says you can only find red things by adventuring amid physical experiences in this actual world. Whitehead, of course, recognizes that colors can, in fact, only ingress under the right spatiotemporal and physiological conditions. The question raised by Goethean color theory concerns the extent to which colors, considered spiritually, bear any necessary internal relations to one another, such that some are simple and others more complex, and such that their ingression into spacetime occurs in accordance with aesthetic principles of metamorphosis, rather than each coming and going on their own arbitrary individual adventures.
You got
For
about 3 minutes,
example,
Matt.
what's that?
You got about 3 minutes.
3 minutes, perfect. For example, while Whitehead claims we could know nothing of red until perceiving it in nature, since, as he says, eternal objects tell no tales as to their ingressions, the phenomenon of accidental colors, studied extensively by Goethe, suggests that experience of green in the visible world already calls forth the complementary color red in the inner activity of our vision, which can be demonstrated by gazing at a green surface for a time before switching to a white surface, which will then momentarily appear reddish. While there may be some tensions in the two accounts of color, there is also evidence of deeper consonance with Goethe, who, like Whitehead, also recognized the emotional and even moral content of each hue. This aside on the relation of colors as possibilities is intended merely to spur new angles of inquiry, both into the structure of abstractive hierarchies, to the extent we can conceive them, and into how Whitehead's metaphysical categories find application in more specific forms of phenomenological research. As Whitehead himself reminds us, quote, the guiding motto in the life of every natural philosopher should be, seek simplicity and distrust it. That's from Concept of Nature. So you can see here I'm trying to explore abstractive hierarchies with a few examples, and I'm finding it difficult to determine when we've really got the base level of simple eternal objects on hand. It seems like it's not so easy to determine. Yesterday, I asked the question of our first presenter, whose name I'm blanking on at the moment, sorry, about this, and she said that, well, we can only ideally conceive in an abstraction the idea of a simple eternal object, which makes sense, though, again, trying to find a concrete example shows that it's not clear how operationalizable this is. So I'll stop there and look forward to comments and questions. And yeah.
Thank you very much, Matt. I'll give Matt a round of applause. You can use your reactions button down below or do it old fashioned. So a reminder, you can click on reactions and then click raise hand to ask a question. Alternatively, you in the chat can just type the word question and then write a question, and I will read that and pose that to our speaker. And we've got a good stack going. And so I'm going to invite in William to unmute himself. Good morning, afternoon, William, wherever you are.
Good morning, everybody from Claremont. Matt, thank you. I love your stuff and everything I've seen about it in your book. Abstractive hierarchy, yes. Color. Is this suggestion? We're just brainstorming here. Why deal with the visual portion of the electromagnetic spectrum only in our speculations here? Is this maybe an artifact of a residual visual chauvinism that Whitehead himself complains about in Western intellectual enterprises? The visual spectrum has that octave business going on. We start at red, orange, green, yellow to violet, and that's it. But there's a lot more to that. The electromagnetic spectrum is a huge medium array, a domain in which these things exist. So what could be primary about one portion of that? And I think that's enough. I'm a musician. I love the idea that we have octaves, multiple octaves stacked on one another, and in visual we have just one. So that's an interesting notion to me. So
it's a great question. I mean, I think immediately of Whitehead's distinction between objective and subjective species of eternal objects, and color would be, the visual spectrum would be the subjective aspect of the full electromagnetic spectrum. The rest of the spectrum beyond our vision, I suppose, would be considered objective, aside from the intensity, perhaps. He says the intensity of energy could be construed as subjective, I believe. So we, beyond the visual spectrum, we can only detect the electromagnetic spectrum using instruments and mathematical equations, right?
Yeah, not necessarily. If you get into the broader spectrum of psychic or the subtle senses, interior reception, things like that, let's not close the book on that quite yet.
Yeah, well, you raise a really interesting question that I couldn't consider in the paper, but I'll continue to reflect on that. I certainly don't want to privilege visual experience to any greater extent than it is due in light of Whitehead's attempt to remind us of the importance of the viscera and all of that. But
we have animals orienting themselves to the electromagnetic field of the earth in migration and such, and native indigenous wisdom of various kinds and sources, going way beyond the visual in what's primary and elementary, orientation of gravity and such. Who knows? Anyway, thank you.
All right, thank you, William. Let's invite in Christian.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. This was fantastic. Just a little suggestion, and I'm not really sure about that also, but maybe it can help you somehow. And that is that I think that Whitehead implicitly distinguishes between what he calls internal relations in the actual domain and the relational essences of eternal objects. This means that internal relations between actual entities imply that each entity in a way reflects the whole of the cosmos, whereas the relational essence of eternal objects do not imply this. I think it is really explicative that in the Harvard lectures, Whitehead refers this idea of the relational essence of eternal objects to Wittgenstein, which is, as we know, a forefather of logical atomism. But Wittgenstein, contrary, for instance, to Russell, did hold that possibilities are relationally structured, but nevertheless, he had that when it comes to the actual relations have no importance anyway. Obviously, Whitehead does not hold this, but I think he combines a view of ideality and abstraction, which is quite similar to that of Wittgenstein, as he himself recognizes, with a completely different view of actuality. And this is also why I think it is in Science and the Modern World. He says that when it comes to the ideal domain, we can carry on a finite analysis of each hierarchy of object, whereas this is impossible in the actual, precisely because each entity implies the whole universe, so that maybe that would be possible for an infinite intellect that in Whitehead's scheme is something that not even God has in a full sense. I don't know if that can make some sense for you, or.
Yeah, thank you. I think that is helpful to distinguish these two kinds of internal relations. And you're also reminding me that Wittgenstein was quite interested in the Goethean color theory that I'm drawing on here. And so I'll have to go back and see what he says. It's unfortunate that Whitehead and Wittgenstein didn't have more of a dialogue with one another, great logicians that they were. I don't know what Wittgenstein thought of Whitehead, but Whitehead obviously didn't think very highly of Wittgenstein. But yeah, thanks, Christian. Appreciate that insight.
Farzad, please.
Hi, that was great. Thanks, Matt. I really enjoyed well, so much of it, but those particular examples you chose, going to Timaeus for the primary bodies and Goethe for the colors, or just color. These are really great places to start this conversation because they bring to bear this that infinitude that Christian was just talking about. Not even God can, work this out when it comes to the actual instance. And just to go back to Timaeus for a moment, the tetrahedron, while it is the simplest in terms of having the least sides, is not necessarily intended, I don't think, by Plato or possibly by Whitehead. I'm not sure. I have to go back and look at that, to be the base out of which, or based upon which, you would work up the other bodies, particularly given the way that Plato uses the bodies to do different, make up different examples, like perception, fire and earth are there first. That kind of could work as a base, but then when he goes on to talk about the medical model of disease and these things coming apart in smaller bodies in the triangles, it becomes ambiguous as to the fiveness of the primary bodies as having some more significance than any other way of looking at them in the Timaeus itself. So it basically reemphasizes the idea that the perspective, or as you said way in the beginning, the use to which you're putting your example, or the thing that you're interested in, is going to determine simplicity versus complexity, base versus apex, and that could be a lot of different things. So I don't see that there could be a universal answer to the question of what is a simple eternal object. And anyway, perhaps that's where Whitehead ended up as well and stopped talking so much about that. But anyway, that's my comment. I don't think that question of the simple eternal object can survive all of these different examples that he himself brings up.
Yeah, no, Whitehead's. Thank you, Farzad. That's helpful to bring more context in from the Timaeus. Whitehead certainly wasn't proposing the tetrahedron as the base of an abstractive hierarchy. He in fact divides it into its surfaces. He says 3 surfaces, interestingly, which I speculate as to why he did that. But I was searching for examples. Like color seems to be a better candidate, for the base of an abstractive hierarchy, but even that seems to be problematic. I get in Process and Reality the important work that simple sensa are doing as part of establishing or maintaining the solidarity of the universe. but I'm not quite sure. Whitehead says specifically this is a metaphysical category, and it's abstracted far from any concrete physiological or physical details. And I just wonder, how do we bring it back in touch with the real world in that case, if it's doing such important work metaphysically? So yeah, as you can see, I've the deeper I got into this subject, the more confused I became about how to actually apply some of these categories. So
Thank you.
Thank you for a great paper, Matt. We had lots of interest and just not enough time. So thank you for everybody. I'm sorry that I couldn't get your question, Kent. But if you'd like to, Matt, you can look at responding to the chat there.